Our keynote speaker today is Erica Dilday. You may have seen her recent appointment as Executive Director of American Documentary, Inc., and Executive Producer of its award-winning documentary series, POV, which is carried on PBS, and America Reframed on the World Channel. Erica was most recently CEO of Futuro Media, as we are fortunate. She serves on the INN Board of Directors, and she also advises us on our INN leadership and diversity programs. And hosting this discussion in partnership with Erica is Susan Smith Richardson, who is now Deputy Editor of The Guardian, also a longtime INN member at the Center for Public Integrity, and before that, the Chicago Reporter. The media focus on racial justice and the racial reckoning within media itself didn't begin in 2020 for either Susan or Erica. They are among the leaders who have really led nonprofit newsrooms in a more inclusive path for years. Also know how far we still have to come. So delighted to have them here today, with Erica taking a look at the journalists, the publishers, the documentary filmmakers who are Black, Indigenous, and people of color, and are producing work with authenticity and power across both journalism and documentaries. So welcome, Erica and Susan.
Oh, thank you, Sue. It's so wonderful to be here, to be back with the INN family, and also to be here with Erica. And I just want to begin by saying congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you, Susan. And I'm so happy to be here and having this discussion with you.
Well, I know we don't have a lot of time, and you have a lot to say. 5 hours, a lifetime's worth. We have 25 minutes, so I'm gonna get right to it. Sue has introduced you, so I just want to say a couple of things before we launch into this conversation and give it a little framework. I mean, you've been in decision-making positions before. Your position as CEO at Futuro Media. But in this job, there's even more power to shape narratives that could result in more authentic journalism about communities of color. And then to top it off, as an INN board member, you have a voice in this really significant, huge nonprofit journalism community. So with kind of this bigger role and bigger megaphone, if you will, I want to start with something that we talk about a lot in journalism, especially as it relates to getting the story right and really capturing America. And that's, what does it mean to produce authentic journalism about communities of color? So I want to start by asking you, what does that mean to you? What does it mean to produce authentic journalism about communities of color?
The first thing for me is the role of the journalist. We have to, as journalists, act as catalysts. It is not up to us to interpret what other people are saying or thinking. It's up to us to relay it in their own words. We've spent too much time deciding, oh, that's what you mean, and then speaking for other people in mainstream journalism. And that, to me, is probably one of our biggest issues. I think the idea of the unbiased journalist, as most of us know, is, just non-existent. Well, the idea is there, but in truth, it doesn't happen. And when you can't own your biases, you're not aware of them. When you're not aware of them, they creep into everything you do. And the only way to represent people authentically is to hold the mic for them instead of speaking into it for them. And by that, I mean quoting people as they speak. I remember a long time ago when I was doing reporting in Boston, and I had spoken to a woman in the Roxbury community who was very smart, very wise, but was not speaking the Queen's English. And my editor at the time wanted to change it because he didn't want her to sound stupid. And, it was a nice thought. It was, well-meaning, but the point was she didn't sound stupid. She just didn't sound like he expected her to sound. And one of the things that we do is by forcing people out of their comfort zones, out of the way they speak, out of the way they relay things, we are putting them in a box that is more comfortable for us. It's like a pop music diet. with jazz or classical music, you have to get used to it. You have to really start to listen to appreciate it. We started a pop music diet of news where everybody has to see and look and sound the same, or else they don't have the right to speak for themselves.
No, this is so interesting. As someone who likes jazz and hip hop, I get it. You're talking different languages, both have their own value, but it seems like you're speaking to this question of, is there a universal framework? Is there a universal perspective? And there is no universal in that sense. I want to quote from something you wrote for Neiman in 2020, the Neiman Reports in 2020, that kind of speaks to what you just said. Our role, speaking to the role of journalist, our role is facilitation instead of, we are facilitators instead of interpreters, catalysts instead of judges. That really speaks to our personal perspectives that we bring to covering communities that we think are universal. But in fact, they're coming from our own personal experience. There is no strong universal narrative that we can apply to all communities.
Absolutely. And one thing I think we don't do is understand that well enough to realize that as we're putting out any type of news, we have to have different people in the room looking at what we're putting out, not just at the bottom levels, but at the top levels. I've seen stories that are editorially sound in the sense that the wording's right, the places are right, but there are things that have been missed because people who are in charge think too much alike and aren't able to see things that they've missed. An example, one of my favorite examples, which was later corrected in the New York Times, which I love and read every day, but was about the Yang Gang. And, to paraphrase, I can put the full quote up, but the writer described the Yang Gang as a merry band of goths, gamers, Asians. I'm trying to think of the other things that were around it, but Asians was the only one that was an ethnic or racial identity, as if goths and gamers and, go-go girls, I think was another one, could not be Asians.
Right.
And how many people did that have to go through before it made it into the paper? And as soon as I read it, I thought, I can't believe that this is in here. And I think one of the things that for me is scariest about something like that is that your average reader is silently being indoctrinated into this idea of, people of color, other marginalized communities as others. They're not multidimensional. They're not, like the armchair reader. They're this one thing and it's another.
Right, a monolith. You can't be a gamer, you can't be a skater, you're just Asian, or you're just Black, or you're just Latino.
Exactly.
And actually, we just posted to someone's question the article in Neiman Reports where you cite the example of the Yang quote. And, these are very deeply unconscious assumptions, right? That just get embedded almost routinely. And we could probably point to, not probably, definitely point to, hundreds of these that just happen without any thought. And that's how they get moved along the process. So one of the things about, and you talked about being in decision-making positions and really having more and more authority to change how things are done, that's both calling things as you see them, really being able to push interrogation of things that we don't think twice about, like the example from the Andrew Yang story, but it's also being able to question and interrogate some of the rules and norms around how we cover journalism. In this same article for Neiman Reports, you talk a lot about this idea of one who gets to tell the story, but also ethical standards that are connected to how we feel we should relate to sources and how that affects the quality of the journalism that we do. So I want to break this into two questions. what, given what you just said, what rules and norms of journalism as a leader do you want to push to change? And give us some examples of issues that you think really speak to these norms and why these norms are a problem.
Sure, and I'll start with my most controversial one, which is I believe that the idea that sources cannot be compensated, I'm not saying, paid, but compensated, is something that we need to rethink. One of the things that we do as journalists is decide that in order to protect the integrity of what we're doing, reporters who may later, sell a story to make it into a book, or newspapers that may place a story on a front page and make money from advertising, are allowed to be compensated. But the person whose story this actually is, who owns it, and who is often not in a position to take care of themselves or profit, is supposed to not be compensated in any way. One of the things that I think, especially when we look at someone's life story, or we're in a refugee camp, is it ethical to take someone's story, to talk to them, to share with them, to take their information, to use it for our readers, but then at the end to say, I'm sorry, but I can't help you because that would be considered unethical and I would be compromised? Does that make sense? I don't think so. And actually, I'm looking at the chat at the same time.
Yes,
Julie Drizzen just asked a really good question about the
Right.
Suave podcast that Futuro did. We told the story of a juvenile lifer who was in prison for 30 years and then got out. And she asked whether or not we compensated Suave, the subject of the podcast.
Right.
And yes, that's actually one of the discussions that we've had for the podcast itself. We did not compensate him. We are negotiating deals for his life rights with different organizations. And one of the things that we've written into all of these contracts is that he would get an immediate payment for this, even though he signed his life rights to us, because it's his life. Mm-hmm. And second of all, he should be an executive producer in any work that we do, because there's no one who can be a better consultant and who can know more about what's going on than he can. And I do think that this idea of reporting not in partnership with communities is a problem. I think if you're going into communities, if you're taking things from them, then just from at least my ethical standpoint, you owe something back. Mm-hmm. We don't ask anybody to do anything for free in that way, except for people who don't have the ability to advocate for themselves. So I think it's something we need to rethink. I mean, I've thought about it, but I think we all should be thinking about it.
So before I ask you a follow-up question about that, for folks who are not aware of the podcast and Suave, can you just briefly explain the podcast?
Sure. The podcast is about a juvenile lifer that Mariana Hossa, our host, had met while speaking at a graduation in Graterford Prison in Philadelphia, or outside of Philadelphia, and whom she had a relationship with, writing back and forth, talking to him about how to be a voice for the voiceless inside there for 25 years, from the time that he thought he was in there for life to the time that he talked about, the ruling came up that potentially juveniles couldn't be sentenced to life, to then whether or not he would be included in it, to his eventual release from prison. And it's a deeply personal story. And it's something that I think is, beautifully told. I didn't tell it. I worked with it, but I didn't tell it. But also it's about the humanity that we need to have in terms of looking at those we've incarcerated. And also how lifetime parole is another jail sentence. It's just on the outside.
I want to follow up on what you said about this ethical standard that would argue, okay, you can't pay the source. You can, in broadly, in no way compensate someone whose life we are taking and, putting out there for, for our audiences. So there is a commercial, whether you're nonprofit or for-profit aspect of all of this, but yet the person whose story is central to our success as journalists, and that does translate to revenue. In no way the idea of compensating that person is considered a conflict of interest. We were kicking this around the other day, and the issue was, where does this even come from? Where are these standards and norms coming from? And how did we even arrive at a point where we're having to have a conversation about having a humanity and a real human and compassionate relationship with people who are willing to share our stories with us, but being told that those relationships ethically are compromised? How did we even get here?
I think it was having the same people in the room making all of the decisions. And there was a hubris in belief that if we talk to each other, we'll eventually hit on all the issues that, should be discussed. We know what's going on, and we can, we're intelligent, ethical people. And I think what I found really sort of shocking in doing research for when I wrote this article was looking at the Kerner Commission report. And again, this was a report in 1968 when the nation, again, was in turmoil, when there were a lot of ethnic and racial tensions. And the question was, the report looked at a number of different ways that we could try and address it as a country, as a nation. And one of them was about journalism. And what was interesting was the report brought up a number of different ideas about how we have to be more inclusive. Now, it advocated for what I considered a little separate but equal idea, but at the same time, it was the same things that we're dealing with now, and we haven't made any more progress, largely because we still did not move to put people in the positions of decision-making who could help to affect change and help to look at things differently. When I started looking at codes of ethics across different countries, Tanzania, there was first understand what it is you feel on an issue to make sure that you are including the opposite viewpoint and that you're seeking out that opposite viewpoint. There was an unconditional understanding that, as a journalist, as someone who's curious and investigate things, you're probably going to have a point of view on something. So you have to make sure that you get the opposite point of view. And we somehow have not been able to look outside of Western journalism and outside of our own sort of majority decision-making process to incorporate more ideals and norms into journalism. And again, I think it's who's sitting at the table. And, there was a question about, the white superiority system and how do we make sure that we're not always incorporating it and relying it. And, one of the things is we have to talk more, and we have to talk more to different people. We have to understand that talking to the same 3 or 4 people who have the same backgrounds, who have the same mindsets, who haven't been through the experiences, particularly of the people on whom we report, is going to stop us from being able to do this effectively or authentically, or what I would say is responsibly. I think often we are irresponsible.
Mm-hmm. No, yeah, we talked a lot about the importance of, in moving into more positions of power and decision-making positions. Isn't just a question of, I'm going to take it and I'm going to just carry on what has been done before. Part of coming into these positions of power is saying, I'm going to transform the way things are done, which is kind of where we started off on this conversation, the Litis Suave and compensation. It's coming into your power and thinking about norms and processes in journalism that we need to blow up. Are there other things that you want to challenge, especially in your position and having such a big influence over documentary films? What other tropes
One of the
and just
things
standards. Yeah.
I think we have to feel free to talk to each other and to discuss more. One of the things that worries me the most right now is I see this fear creeping into journalism, into documentary, into other forms of communication where people are afraid of being either canceled or thought poorly of if they ask questions to which they don't have the answer. And we have to be willing to talk to each other. The way I see it, the issues that we have in journalism are everyone's problem. They're all of our problems, and we'll solve them together. You know, we don't create inclusion by excluding someone else. The point of being journalist is to be curious and to learn and to experience things and to defend points and to hear other people's points of view. And I don't know that there is enough of that going on right now. I speak to a number of different people who are in similar positions to mine, a lot of them, you know, who are white and who are concerned about how they do this right. And first of all, there's no right. There's no absolute right move. There are right intentions and there are right questions, and you get the answers to those. And also, we have to be willing to have someone ask us a question that sometimes we're surprised they ask, and understand that it's for the purpose of creating a better medium. And I don't think we do enough of that.
I mean, it seems that, you know, we were talking about this earlier, that the being comfortable with interrogating means you have to be comfortable with putting your foot in your mouth sometimes and saying
Exactly.
the right thing. And if there's going to be change in newsrooms or in the industry, there has to be a space that allows a level of candor and constructive criticism that doesn't end up saying, okay, you know, take your raggedy ideas and you're canceled, right? There's the line between, you got to have the candor, you have to have the constructive engagement around why an idea hinders our journalism. And then you have to be able to move out of a space where people are are canceled. So I want to talk about, you know, some examples in your own experience of engaging folks to get them to a broader and a deeper quality of journalism. I'm just noticing in some of our conversations going here on the side, folks are talking about, you know, getting past some binary approach to anything, because we know profound storytelling and everything that you've talked about is really about complexity and nuance. When you talk about
Exactly.
journalism and giving people voice, we're not doing a cookie cutter approach to any group. We're letting people exist in their full humanity. So we know we're human beings as journalists. We are not these separate creatures. But so often when it comes to the practice, it becomes a challenge to begin to think about people in a more complex way. So give me some examples of how you've worked in environments to move, you know, to move folks out of thinking in these binary, or if you are Asian, you are simply Asian, you can't be a skateboarder. How do you have those conversations to move a culture from, okay, candor to constructive criticism to, I'm not going to cancel you, but we've got to grow as a newsroom?
You know, it's funny because I often find people are most open to these conversations when they feel challenged or vulnerable. And when I say vulnerable, I think people of color always feel vulnerable. And what I'm trying to move people toward is not the idea that vulnerability is the most important feeling, because I hate in many ways that we always feel vulnerable. It's about humility. It's about knowing that I grew up in Mississippi, and I grew up with spending a lot of time around, my classmates were the children of a lot of civil rights leaders. And one of the things that I found most interesting was how humble, the humility of the people that I was around. It was about what they could do for other people, what they could do for the movement, how they could be a tool to bring about change, to bring about progress, and less about their particular position within the movement. Now, that's not everybody, but the ones who I admired the most. And I think one of the things that I try and do is ask people, what do you want your legacy to be within, journalism, within documentary film? What is it that you're looking to do? Because I know it's got to be more than just make your name known. And do you think that how you approach things now is going to get you to doing that? What can you change? How would you look at it differently? And if so, who do you need to talk to?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, I want to address something, and we've been talking about this, but I want to address this head on. So, and this is, as someone says, a question of power and access. So when we started this conversation, we started it with, you are in an increasingly, you have a bigger megaphone now, you have more power. But I know that, and we talked about the importance of, with you coming into power as a Black woman, you're also thinking about, wait a minute, I just don't want to inherit the systems that exist. I want to interrogate and change those. Another part of the power question, as someone's pointing out here, is also access and whose voice gets heard. How can you, in your position, expand those voices, with a key point on how those of us who've been in newsrooms for a long time, and you'll share this experience, are not continuing to feel marginalized in these spaces where our ideas for coverage are not accepted. How do you use your power to do that, both in terms of who's in there, and let's talk a little bit more about really pushing ideas of access and accountability for voice.
One thing I've learned over the years that, say I wouldn't have done 20 years ago, is to constantly speak up. And I will also, give kudos to our field in general, in that we're more willing to take chances and to listen to and to put into positions people like myself and like you, Susan, who are willing to speak up. I remember there is a mentor I have, a Black woman journalist who pioneered in a lot of ways. And she told me that her feeling used to be, is this the hill I'm going to die on this week? Because I can't call out everything. I just become a troublemaker. So I have to take my pick. I don't take my pick anymore. I feel that it is my duty and responsibility to, if I see something wrong, with a level of humility, say, I think this is wrong. Either we need to discuss it or we need to change it, but it's wrong. And my dad told me, my father moved us to Mississippi he went to run a TV station. He was the first Black man to run a TV station in the country. And it was definitely an interesting time and an interesting experience. But he always said to me, if you believe in change, you don't have the luxury of being comfortable. And I believe in change. And I would rather lose a position for agitating than keep one because I kept my mouth shut. And I feel that 10, 15 years ago, I will not name places, but there have been places where either I was pushed out or felt like I had to leave because I wasn't going to have the ability to do that. And I think it still happens a lot, but I also think there's strength in numbers. I mean, one of the things that I'm seeing in the chat too is people recounting experiences where that has happened. My feeling is, write to me, write to people who are in positions of power when you see something like that happen, because I promise you, I'll be on the line to ask what happened. And I think part of it is we owe a debt to other people who are trying to make change. to work toward making change together.
Yeah. I think this is so important, what's starting to play out in this conversation in the chat. And I hate that now we are pushing against our timeline here. I want to say this one thing, and Eric, I'm sure we probably are feeling the same way on this. There is a whole conversation about the relationship between the I and the we, the individual action and the movement building that, we've always had in journalism to transform the work that it does to even first begin to cover our communities, but to cover our communities accurately. And that relationship with those of us, the collective work that's landed in, those of us getting these positions and opportunity to wield a level of power. A whole nother conversation. Sue, I'm going to say INN and every other organization needs to have this. But I know, Eric, it's as we come to an end here, and I feel like we're at a beginning. I do want to give you the opportunity to just leave folks with one important thought. I know it's important to you that people always leave a conversation with something they can do. So what do you want to say to folks?
Yeah, and thank you, Susan. I mean, one thing that's, as Susan said, important to me is that, I don't want to just talk. I also want to ask you to do something. And what I would ask you to do is make sure to have at least one conversation with fellow journalists about how you cover marginalized communities, how you cover communities of color, how you cover communities where people don't often get to speak with themselves. One conversation, whether it's, in a chat here or with other people you work with, or, speak to the heads of your organizations and tell them it's my fault. But have those conversations, just at least one. If there's anything that Susan and I have talked about that's inspired you at all today, or in the chat, people have posted some absolutely amazing ideas and thoughts. So just have one conversation.
Thank you, Erica. I will look forward to more conversations so we can go deeper on these questions and challenges of leadership and the ability to transform journalism. Thank you, Sue, for providing the opportunity to have this conversation.
Thank you, Sue.
We need to have so many more of these conversations.
So what I'll say, thank you both. And in the chat, and people are privately messaging me, can we take more time and can we do this? So let's consider this. I don't even want to say it's a start, because I think there have been a lot of discussions. We started talking about this last year, but let's look at doing something more regularly and creating spaces for this, small groups, big groups, and we can absolutely do that, and I'll pledge to you we will do that. I think this is this really exciting moment when journalism ethics are changing really quickly, and not in really good ways, as well as ways that are really challenging for someone like me who grew up in traditional ones. But I think it's this phenomenal, important moment. So, and if we're going to get to more equity in media, if we're going to get to more inclusiveness, it has to. So thank you for this amazing discussion.